The United States of America is the wealthiest nation in the history of human civilization. Its GDP is larger than the next three countries combined. And yet, right now, 168 million Americans cross a structurally deficient bridge every single day. How did the world's richest country end up here? And can $1.2 trillion actually fix it? America built the modern world: the interstate highway system, the Brooklyn Bridge, the Hoover Dam, the transcontinental railroad. For most of the 20th century, American infrastructure was the benchmark every other nation measured itself against. Then something went wrong. In this documentary, we're going to cover exactly how America's infrastructure ended up in crisis, why fixing it is so much harder than it sounds, what the $1.2 trillion Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is actually building right now, and whether it's going to be enough. This is the story of a nation trying to rebuild itself, and the jaw-dropping scale of what that actually takes. Let's start with the facts, because the numbers are genuinely staggering. America's 2025 Infrastructure Report Card, published by the American Society of Civil Engineers, gave the country an overall grade of C, the highest score since assessments began, and it's still described as emblematic of mediocrity. AC, the richest country on Earth? AC. 43% of America's public roads are in poor or mediocre condition. 46,000 bridges are rated structurally deficient, and 42% of the country's 617,000 bridges are more than 50 years old. More than 168 million trips are taken across bridges in poor condition every single day in the United States. 168 million trips across bridges that engineers have flagged as deficient every day. And it is not just roads and bridges. About 6 billion gallons of treated drinking water leak out of America's pipes every single day, enough to fill more than 9,000 swimming pools. Every day, gone into the ground. America's infrastructure crisis isn't a future problem. It's happening right now, under every car, on every road, through every pipe in the country. To understand how America got here, you have to go back to the 1950s. After World War II, America went on the greatest infrastructure building spree in human history. President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1956, authorizing the construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highway. It was the largest public works project ever attempted, and it worked brilliantly. Those highways connected cities, drove economic growth, and turned America into the most mobile nation on Earth. But here's what nobody planned for. Those highways, those bridges, those water systems were built to last 50 years. The bridges that form the backbone of America's interstate highway system began construction during the Eisenhower administration more than 60 years ago. Its GDP engineers have confirmed we are nearing the end of life for some of those bridges. In fact, we are beyond it in some cases. America built an extraordinary infrastructure system, and then, for decades, chose not to maintain it. The federal government spent $1.5 trillion on surface transportation between 1991 and 2025, and roads, bridges, and transit systems barely improved. The scores on America's Infrastructure Report Card have remained almost unchanged for 25 years. Trillions spent, almost no improvement. America's infrastructure crisis wasn't caused by a lack of money. It was caused by decades of spending money on the wrong things, building new roads instead of maintaining the ones already there. And then, in March 2024, the crisis stopped being a statistic. At 1:28 in the morning on March 26, 2024, a cargo ship lost power in Baltimore Harbor. It drifted. It hit a support column of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. And in seconds, a major interstate bridge collapsed into the water. 6 construction workers were killed. The Port of Baltimore, one of America's busiest, was shut down for months, and the economic damage ran into billions of dollars. The collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge in 2024 underscored the fragility of systems once celebrated as engineering triumphs, and brought America's infrastructure vulnerability into sharp focus for millions of people who had never thought about it before. The bridge that fell wasn't even one of the 46,000 flagged as structurally deficient. It was considered to be in acceptable condition, which raises a question nobody in Washington wanted to answer. If a bridge in acceptable condition can fall, What does that say about the 46,000 that aren't? Infrastructure failure isn't a slow, gradual decline, it's invisible, right up until the moment it isn't. But here's where the story shifts. Because in 2021, something happened that hadn't happened in America in a generation. Both political parties agreed on something. On November 15, 2021, President Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act into law. The law authorized $1.2 trillion for transportation and infrastructure spending, with $550 billion going toward entirely new investments and programs. It was the largest infrastructure investment in American history, and the list of what it covers is genuinely staggering. Roads and bridges, passenger rail, ports and waterways, airports, electric vehicle charging networks, broadband internet for rural communities, lead pipe replacement in drinking water systems, power grid upgrades, and flood protection. The Act funded nearly 400 separate infrastructure programs, at spending levels nearly twice as high as before the law was enacted. For the first time in decades, America was going to fix its infrastructure. Or so it seemed. The $1.2 trillion Infrastructure Act wasn't just a spending bill. It was a national admission that decades of neglect had finally caught up with the world's most powerful economy. Here's the part they didn't put in the press releases. 4 years after the bill was signed, progress has been slower than expected. As of the end of 2024, federal agencies had only obligated 47% of authorized funds for 2022 to 2024, and had actually paid out just 21%. 21% of the money that was supposed to be rebuilding America actually spent. The EV charging network tells the story perfectly. The Act set aside $7.5 billion for electric vehicle charging stations. By April 2025, just 68 charging stations with 384 total spots had been built. 68 stations, from a $7.5 billion program in 4 years. And then in January 2025, the incoming Trump administration froze selected infrastructure grants, creating further uncertainty for projects that communities had been counting on for years. The money exists. The need is undeniable. But America's ability to actually build things, quickly, efficiently, and at scale, has become one of the country's deepest structural problems. America doesn't just have an infrastructure problem. It has a building problem, a systemic inability to turn money into completed projects at the speed the crisis demands. And nowhere is that contrast more painful than when you look at one specific project. Japan built its bullet train in 1964. France launched its high-speed rail in 1981. China now has more high-speed rail than the rest of the world combined. And America? The fastest passenger train in the United States, the Acela, averages 68 miles per hour between New York and Washington. 68 miles per hour, on a route that Japan would complete in under an hour. California tried to change that. In 2008, voters approved a high-speed rail project connecting Los Angeles to San Francisco, projected to cost $33 billion and open by 2020. It is now projected to cost over $100 billion, and a complete system won't open until the 2030s at the earliest. The Infrastructure Act tried to help, investing in passenger rail at levels equivalent to the total federal funding for Amtrak across its entire history. But building high-speed rail in America faces a challenge that China and Japan simply don't have. Private land ownership, environmental reviews, local opposition, legal challenges, political interference. In China, the government decides to build a railway. Workers show up the next week. In America, the environmental impact assessment alone can take a decade. America's infrastructure problem isn't just about money or political will. It's about a system that makes building things extraordinarily slow and extraordinarily expensive. But here's what the doom and gloom misses. Things are being built. Real things that real people will use. Across America right now, hundreds of bridge replacement projects are underway. The Infrastructure Act provided $27.5 billion for the Bridge Formula Program and $12.5 billion for the Bridge Investment Program. and the percentage of bridges in poor condition has already dropped from 7.3% in 2020 to 6.8% in 2024. It's slow, but it's moving. In rural communities that have never had reliable internet, broadband cables are being laid for the first time. The act invested $65 billion to close the digital divide, with $45 billion specifically allocated to deploy broadband in areas that currently have none. Ports and inland waterways received $17 billion, supporting the $289 trillion in GDP and 21.8 million jobs that depend on America's port infrastructure. And lead water pipes, the ones that poison the children of Flint, Michigan, are finally being replaced. $15 billion was set aside specifically for lead service line replacement across the country. None of this is as fast as it should be. None of it is as visible as a new skyscraper or a gleaming high-speed rail line. But for the family in rural Mississippi, who just got internet for the first time, for the child in a city whose tap water is now safe to drink, for the commuter crossing a bridge that's been reinforced after decades of neglect, it's not nothing. America's infrastructure recovery isn't cinematic. It's slow, unglamorous, and buried underground. But it's happening. One pipe, one bridge, one cable at a time. That's the full story of America's infrastructure crisis. How the world's richest nation let its foundations crumble, the $1.2 trillion plan trying to fix it, and why rebuilding a superpower is so much harder than building one in the first place. If you enjoy documentaries covering the mega projects and infrastructure challenges shaping our world, subscribe to BuildSculptor. New episodes every week. Next time, we're heading to Dubai, a city that built the world's busiest airport and is now constructing something 5 times its size that will handle more passengers than any airport ever built. Don't miss it.